You might be surprised or intrigued to see water coming up within A-level biology because water's not alive, but actually it's really important to the study of biology for a number of reasons. Firstly, water is the most abundant molecule in our bodies, making up something like 60 to 70%. But also it has a number of quite special and quite surprising properties, and if it weren't for these properties, it's unlikely that life on Earth would still exist. Let's start off by looking at the structure of water because this helps to explain some of the properties that it has. You're hopefully already familiar with this from your GCSE studies, either from the dot and cross diagram below or the ball and stick model above. Each water molecule consists of two hydrogen atoms, which in the ball and stick model are represented by the white balls, covalently bonded to one oxygen atom. In other words, they're sharing pairs of electrons. An oxygen bonded to a hydrogen is sometimes referred to as a hydroxy group. The covalent bonds between the hydrogen atoms and the oxygen atoms are incredibly strong, and so these do not break. So this means that when water melts or when it boils, it's not the covalent bonds that are being broken. Instead, it's the weak intermolecular forces between two molecules. In the previous video, I referred to the fact that elements like oxygen and also fluorine have a property known as electronegativity. So oxygen is more electronegative than hydrogen. This means that it is good at pulling the electrons in a covalent bond towards itself. And since electrons are negatively charged, this means that the oxygen atom ends up with a very slight negative charge and the hydrogen atoms end up with a very slight positive charge. These charges are much, much smaller than the charges that we see on cations and anions like sodium and chloride. So we use the lowercase delta symbol to show that this is a very small change. Because we have a molecule that is not symmetrical and therefore it now has one positive side and one negative side, we describe this molecule as being polar. Water's polarity leads to a particularly strong type of intermolecular force, which is called a hydrogen bond. It's really important that you understand that hydrogen bonds are a weak intermolecular force. It's not the same thing as the covalent bond. But even though it is a weak intermolecular force, it is the strongest type of weak intermolecular force. Since there are multiple hydrogen bonds between water molecules, this makes water a very stable structure, and it lends it some surprising properties. When you're drawing hydrogen bonding between water molecules, you want to line up your water molecules so that you have one straight line that goes from an oxygen to a hydrogen and then through that hydrogen's bond onto the oxygen. As you can see, we have the same delta charges that we saw on the previous slide to indicate that the oxygen atoms are slightly negative and the hydrogen atoms are slightly positive. And we draw the hydrogen bond as a dotted or dashed line between the oxygen and the hydrogen. To make sure that made sense, pause the video and see if you can describe how hydrogen bonds form between two water molecules and why it is that water can form these hydrogen bonds. Hydrogen bonds are a weak intermolecular force and they occur between the oxygen on one water molecule and the hydrogen on an adjacent water molecule. They're able to form because the oxygen is slightly negatively charged and the hydrogen is slightly positively charged. And you might have chosen to explain that this is due to the differences in electronegativity. And therefore, water is a polar molecule. You should also be able to draw two water molecules showing the relationship between them. So this would be a 3-mark question. And our first mark would be for having our dotted or dashed line that goes from the oxygen of one molecule to the hydrogen of the next one. Our second mark would be for labelling this as a hydrogen bond. And then our third mark is for putting on our partial charges. You should be aware that if you're taking A-level chemistry, it would also be vital that you have the 180-degree angle between these, otherwise you wouldn't get full marks. As we've said, water has a number of properties that are unusual or surprising for a molecule of its size. It's referred to as the universal solvent, it remains a liquid at room temperature, it has high specific heat capacity and high latent heat at both vaporization and fusion, it has some unusual density properties, wetness, capillarity, surface tension, it's colourless and transparent with low viscosity and difficult to compress. Some of these properties are incredibly important for life as we know it to exist. A solvent is a liquid that other substances can dissolve in, And water is called the universal solvent because it can dissolve more substances than any other liquid. This is largely due to the fact that it is a highly polar molecule, making it easier for charged or polar particles to dissolve. So it's very easy for something like sodium chloride to dissolve because the water molecules will orient themselves in such a way that the negative side of the water molecule, where the oxygen is arranged around the positive ion of sodium, and then the slightly positive hydrogen atoms in the water molecules are arranged around a negative ion like a chloride ion. But this doesn't just apply to charged ions, because actually most important biological molecules are polar. Glucose has many polar hydroxy groups, so glucose molecules in aqueous solution are also surrounded by a cloud of water molecules. Since key biological molecules like amino acids, proteins, and nucleic acids are slightly polar, water's property as a solvent allows these substances to be easily transported. So this could involve getting useful molecules into the cell, getting waste products or toxins out of the cell, and also transporting substances through an organism, such as transporting things through the apoplast pathway. It's also really important that as the universal solvent, water is able to allow different metabolic reactions to happen inside the cells. It can also be used to dilute substances. Pause the video and see if you can explain how the ability of water to act as a solvent is important for organisms' survival. In other words, what functions is it carrying out? It allows metabolic reactions to take place in cells. It allows the transport of substances, the absorption of minerals, ions, gases, and digestive products, and it's also able to dilute toxic substances. In GCSE physics, you learned that specific heat capacity was the amount of energy required to raise the temperature of a kilogram of a substance by 1 degree C. Now, in A-level biology, we don't need to do the maths to work out the specific heat capacity of a particular substance, but actually the specific heat capacity of water is important and useful. Water has a very high specific heat capacity. In other words, heating it up requires a lot of energy. This is because all of those hydrogen bonds between the molecules take more energy to overcome than other types of weak intermolecular force. Because of this, aquatic environments have a very stable temperature. If you've ever been into the sea on a really sunny day, you'll know that actually it's quite hard to heat the sea up, and it can be very warm outside, but the sea can remain relatively cold. And this is useful for aquatic organisms that need a stable temperature to live in. The high specific heat capacity of water tells us that it's possible to give water quite a lot of energy without its temperature changing by much. But the high specific latent heat of water tells us that it's also possible to give water quite a lot of energy without changing its state. The specific latent heat of fusion is the amount of energy required to melt some ice, and the specific latent heat of vaporization is the amount of energy required to boil some water. This graph shows the boiling points of the hydrides of the different group 6 elements. You can see from the general trend that the closer to the top of the periodic table the group 6 element is, the lower you would expect the boiling point to be. But the one substance that's bucking the trend is water, which has a much higher boiling point than expected. This is because water has a high specific latent heat of vaporization, and it requires a lot of energy to change the state from a liquid to a gas. This means that water is a liquid at room temperature, even though we wouldn't expect that to be the case. This is important because if water followed the trend of the rest of the group 6 hydrides, then it would have a boiling point that was well below zero, and we would expect that everywhere on Earth the oceans would already have evaporated, and therefore life wouldn't exist. The high specific latent heat of vaporization is also important because it means that quite a large amount of energy can be removed by sweat evaporating and also by transpiration, and this is a really good cooling mechanism for both animals and plants. The same hydrogen bonding that gives water a high specific heat capacity and a high specific latent heat also pulls the water molecules closer to each other, and this leads water to have a slightly higher density than we would expect, of 1 gram per centimetre cubed. When water freezes, the molecules become arranged in a more regular pattern, and this means that the water becomes less dense, which is incredibly unusual. This means that when ice forms, it floats on the top of water, therefore insulating the water underneath it. If this property didn't exist, then ice would sink, and because it was further away from the sun, it would never melt, and gradually the oceans would freeze and they would just become completely solid and there would be no way for any of it to ever melt. You may not have heard of adhesion, but you've certainly heard of adhesive, in other words, glue, which is used to stick two different substances together. So adhesion is sticking different substances together, and cohesion means sticking the same substance together. So when we say that water has cohesive properties, what that means is that water likes to stick to water. And that means that within a body of water, each water molecule is attracted to the other water molecules around it. And this means that when transpiration happens and water is moving by mass flow up the xylem, then the pulling force from the transpiration is transmitted to that whole column of water, and the column of water doesn't break. These same cohesive forces mean that the water molecules that are at the top of a bulk of water are slightly closer together than those lower down. And this leads to a property called surface tension, which is basically the ability of that liquid to resist a force. So in other words, if you push down on the surface of the water is pushing back slightly. And this allows some insects like pond skaters to move about on the surface of water. So to summarise the most important properties of water, it's a good solvent because water molecules are attracted both to ions and also polar molecules. This allows water to transport different substances in the blood, the xylem and the phloem. It has a very high specific heat capacity, so therefore huge amounts of energy are required to overcome the hydrogen bonds between water molecules and raise the temperature. And this prevents rapid changes both in the temperature inside cells and bodies and also in the oceans and other large bodies of water. It has a high specific latent heat of vaporization, which means that it's very challenging to evaporate or boil water. This means that it's an effective coolant in transpiration, sweating and panting, and it also stops the oceans from just boiling away. Water is denser as a liquid than a solid because the hydrogen bonds that hold the water molecules further apart from each other in their solid form, and this means that ice floats, insulating large bodies of water. And also water molecules have high cohesion because the hydrogen bonds hold the water molecules together, and this helps to draw water up xylem vessels. So let's pause the video and see how many of these questions you can answer now. Specific heat capacity is the amount of energy required to raise the temperature of 1 kilogram of a substance by 1 degree Celsius, whereas specific latent heat of vaporization is the energy required in order to change 1 kilogram of a substance from a liquid to a gas without needing to change its temperature. Cohesion is the attractive force that holds particles of the same substance together, whereas surface tension is the ability of a liquid to resist an external force due to the cohesion at the surface. Can you also explain how cohesion helps with water transport in a plant? So water moves up the xylem by mass flow, and this is possible because cohesion between the molecules holds the transpiration column together. This allows the pulling force from transpiration to be transmitted to the whole column, so all of the water moves up. Water molecules have a slight positive charge at one end of the molecule and a slight blank charge at the other end. They are therefore described as blank. So the first gap is obviously going to be negative and the second is going to be polar. This makes water a good something for charged and something substances such as sugars. So this is going to be a reference to it being a good solvent for charged and polar substances such as sugars. The weak intermolecular forces between water molecules are called something bonds. So hopefully you remembered that those are hydrogen bonds. Water requires a lot of energy to change state. This is because it has a high latent heat. Water also requires a lot of energy to raise its temperature. This is because it has a high specific heat capacity. Water makes up the majority of a cell's cytoplasm. Many different compounds dissolve in water because it is an excellent solvent. Water remains a liquid over a wide range of temperatures. Below 4 degrees, it becomes less dense than warm water. Ice can float on water, insulating the water beneath, so large bodies of water rarely freeze entirely. The hydrogen bonds between water molecules provide it with high surface tension or cohesion, allowing small insects and even pygmy geckos to move on its surface without sinking. Thanks very much for watching, and I hope you're now feeling really confident about all things water. If you did find this video useful, then don't forget to like, subscribe, comment and share the channel, and I'll be back soon with some more A-level biology.